In the penultimate episode of Silo's first season, Juliette watched a video recording that George Wilkins left for her before he died. In that, he revealed that he found a door below the silo. And in what almost played like a throwaway line, he mentioned he knew she would be wondering about the water down there, and says it turned out to be nothing to worry about. This connects back to the scene that closed the second episode of the series, where we learned about her fear of water when she wasn't able to follow the path he laid out for her. If only she had seen the video and had all the information. It would have saved her a couple of seasons of beating herself up in George's absence because she felt like she let him down. It also may have prevented her from being sent outside and everything that came after that. When he encountered the water, Lukas Kyle didn't need to know what was in the video because he was able to surmise that the water couldn't be that deep. There must be some unknown pump put in place, or maybe even still being monitored by someone outside of the silo, or else the whole lower area would be flooded by now. Cheryl asks if he's sure about that because he'd be putting his life on the line. And for where he's at in his story, that doesn't really matter. He explains what's motivating him when he visits his mother earlier in the episode. You'll remember that when Juliette asked for his help with the hard drive last season, he said he couldn't do it because he was the only one taking care of his mom. We find out that this was news to her in a pretty funny scene because he doesn't, and therein lies the point. He lied to Juliette because he was afraid to get involved because he didn't want to get in trouble. It's been haunting him ever since, and I should add that his further inaction of not turning her in got him sent to the mines anyway. So now he's determined to not make that same mistake again. All of this setup made for a truly memorable reveal when he finally lets go of the rope to fall into water that only turns out to be waist deep. I'll come back to what happens after that, but I wanted to start here because I think it's worth pointing out that the creators planted a seed 17 episodes ago, added another layer at exactly this point last season, connected another main character from this season to that same mystery, and then paid it all off in a pretty satisfying way here. With only one episode left to go in its second season, it's the kind of thing you like to see. It makes for the best episode this season, even as it sets up another mystery in its title, The Safeguard. There are plenty of answers and payoffs to go around, and what appears to be the conclusion for Jules' time in Silo 17. We fast forward through that again, only this time we see the events through the new characters' perspectives. Silo 17's other inhabitants aren't exactly survivors of the rebellion. They're children of survivors who were only kids or babies themselves during that time. Knowing Solo's backstory from reading the book made this a little harder to talk about without giving away that he was also a child when that happened. But knowing that Steve Zahn is in his late 50s and that we only vaguely knew it happened at least 25 years ago might have clued you into the fact that the trio we saw at the end of the last episode have never known anything but a life in a destroyed silo. As you might imagine, that's had an effect on them. The extent that it shaped them starts to become clear when we realize they call Solo the killer. Sure, he's been kind of weird and prone to throwing tantrums, but a killer? There must be more to that story, right? There is, but because of the way things played out, Audrey, Rick, and Eder, whose real name we still don't know, and Benny, and the baby, there's a baby, the only thing they really know about Solo, or Jimmy if you prefer, is that he killed their parents. As we go through things again and they watch Juliette arrive, we see them do things we know they did, like Audrey cutting the rope, but also things like Rick saving her by throwing the plastic container she's able to grab hold of when she surfaces into the water. From their point of view, they have a legitimate reason to go after Solo, and all the goodies he has locked away with him in the vault. Audrey is essentially the leader and pushes more toward violent solutions, but Rick often undermines her by looking for other ways to get the things they need. Then there's Eder, who we saw set up the fake Solo ambush last week. There's no way to sugarcoat it, they treat her badly. And we eventually find out it's because after her mother died, their parents took her in, and that extra mouth to feed was part of the reason they were so desperately trying to get into the vault. They were starving and needed food for their children. While Jules is sympathetic to their stories, I mean, how could you not be? Audrey has complicated things by giving her an impossible time frame to get into the vault, or promises she'll finally kill Solo. Jules can't abide that initially because she needs to find out what he did with her suit. So she has this impossible task to do something no one else has been able to do in the past couple of decades by the time Audrey's baby is ready to feed again. In my earlier videos, I mentioned there was a lot going on in the background of the 17 scenes that I thought would take on new meaning once everything was revealed. So it was fun watching Juliette put those things together. The numbers on the chalkboard turned out to be a big one. They were the way Chase and Tess kept track of the ones they tried before they eventually got in. They figured this out when they went to Russell's apartment, where Juliette learns he has a son and also finds his suit, the one every head of IT has. Bernard mentioned the one he has earlier in the season when talking to Judge Meadows. And it's at this point that Juliette could have just grabbed that and ditched Eater and left if she really wanted to. She decides not to, and when they return to the classroom where she saw the numbers, she realizes they eventually got into the vault. Otherwise, Solo wouldn't have killed them. And she erased the correct code they used while working on her plan. She thinks she can figure it out, but there isn't much time. As she works, Eater has a minute to look around and wants to know why everyone has two names. She says her mom only gave her one, but Jules is too distracted to ask what it is. She's narrowed the list down to 6 code combinations, and she gets 3 tries per day. When they get to the vault, she tries the first 2, and that leaves her with one last attempt to put in the correct code. The name Solo comes up, and she starts to wonder who this guy she spent most of the season with is if he's not Solo. She remembers the strange conversation in the classroom and realizes the story about the girl he remembered was real. He wasn't very convincing when he lied about it, but she's just now starting to put it together. That means that when the rebellion happened, he was just a kid. And when she went back to the classroom to check, she found out his full name was Jimmy Conroy, and he was Russell's kid. Of course, if you roll back the tape in your head, this means he was talking about himself giving the real Solo his nickname when he told that story. And like the opening sequence where we see everything from the other perspective, it recontextualizes everything that happened in Silo 17 this season. Rather than gamble on her last attempt, she decides to use this new information to convince Solo to help. She manages to get Rick to let her in after Eater returns the bracelet she retrieved from his mother's body. Jimmy is in lousy shape and says that he failed. At first, he assumes Juliette got in and is a little surprised she's there when he finds out she didn't. She explains she knows he's not Russell's shadow, he's his son. At about the same time, Audrey returns and wants to kill him because that's pretty much what she does, but Rick wants to hear his side of the story. Then the talk turns to Chase and Tess getting in, and we find out it happened while he was asleep. He left his gun by the door, they found it there, and used it to shoot him. The kids don't want to believe him, and things get tougher when he explains that he broke off the inside handle and closed the door after they got into the food vault. They couldn't get out because it was sealed, and Jimmy confirms Rick's suspicions that he left them to suffocate to death by not answering when he asks. Now Audrey really wants to kill him, but has to accept he's telling the truth when Juliette convinces him to show them the scar from his gunshot wound. Throughout this whole exchange, Juliette does a surprisingly good job of finding the right tone to approach these sensitive topics. She uses everything she learned about this preteen trapped in a grown man's body who has spent decades in isolation, and this new group of kids who didn't have it easy growing up either. As her time in Silo 17 ends, it's evident that it changed her, as did her time with Jimmy Conroy, who ultimately turns out to be a young boy just trying to do the last thing his father told him to. The final piece of his tragic story comes to light when he talks about that. He says he doesn't want to be remembered as Jimmy because he was a coward. He hid behind the door that Solo protected all these years, even when the sheriff held a gun to his father's head. We see how that played out in a flashback that answers one of the questions the one in the opening episode left us with. When the sheriff and his wife were talking after they stormed IT, he said his hand slipped. He didn't mean to. All while his wife is cleaning up his face. We now know that he brought Russell up to the door at gunpoint to try to force Jimmy to open the vault, and ended up accidentally shooting him in the face, killing him in front of his son. This gets a lot of feelings going around and even manages to break through Audrey's defenses. After Jules helps Solo see that his father wasn't trying to save the vault, he was trying to save his son, he starts to forgive himself. And when he finds out that Audrey and Rick have a baby that they're trying to protect, he decides to let them in. I probably don't need to say that Steve Zahn and Rebecca Ferguson nailed this, but I will because it's that good. I've been waiting all season to see what Solo's vault looks like compared to Bernard's, and there were no disappointments there either. Man, what song would you choose to play for a bunch of people who never heard music? I guess Monster Mash works since they're kids, but hopefully he'll expand their horizons soon. This episode had me by the time Solo started to come around and suggested they all try ice cream for the first time. But then it buried me when Jimmy realized that Juliette could have left when she found the suit but stayed there for him. Of course, this wouldn't work nearly as well without all the scenes they shared along the way, but the choice to have him show his appreciation with a simple hand on the shoulder really put it over the top. That's where things end in that silo, and while the journey there was frustrating at times, I think it came together really well in the end. It would be hard for Silo 18 to top that, and most of what happens there doesn't, but it does get us closer to a season-ending conflict, and that ending I mentioned at the beginning is pretty good. I was a little surprised that Bernard took a back seat, or at least stayed in a seat watching the camera on Walker's apartment for most of the episode. Tim Robbins still managed to deliver some quality face acting as things played out, and I guess it makes sense since his being unavailable when Lukas goes looking for him has his shadow going to the down deep on his own. They share one scene before that happens where he corrects the idea that the founders built 50 silos. He tells them technically there are 51 without elaborating any further, and just saying he doesn't know when Lukas asks him why they were built in the first place. The key piece of information he passes along is that Juliette was alive and made it to another silo before the camera in her helmet cut out. He adds that all IT heads in their shadows know about the other silos and tells him to continue working to find out what Quinn was really trying to say with his coded message. Then he goes to sit and watch his walk cam. He sees Knox come in and finds out what Billings is up to. Paul and his wife discuss the page from the travel guide again and decide they deserve to know the truth about what happened outside. The conversation she has with Patrick Kennedy later also adds to this. For one of its truest adherents, the influence of the pact is starting to fade. Paul pledges to help the mechanicals, but doesn't have much to offer after publicly calling out Bernard and Sims. They realize they might be able to call on Camille again, though. She did save Knox and Shirley on their way back down, but it wouldn't be easy to contact her. It's here that the sheriff makes himself useful. He passes along a message to her husband with a report about a relic and gives him the page when he arrives at the barricades. He tells him that he believes Camille might care more about the silo than anything else and believes Rob might get on board when he sees the page. When he looks at it with Camille, they wonder if things might be all right outside and decide if they are, they owe it to their son to help the mechanicals. There's a lot that isn't completely clear here. Primarily what Paul asked Rob to do. But if the rebels end up toppling Bernard, what sense would it make to stick with him after he cast Rob aside? He mentions the Down Deep would never accept him, and she agrees to do what she can. Then he does mention he has this other thing, Bernard's key fob with the 18 on it that lights up, and tells her how Bernard goes to the server room when things go sideways. I found it pretty surprising that they didn't know about the vault, but I guess that makes sense, and really adds to Bernard's sense of isolation if you think about it. As his support wanes, Bernard meets with the deputies and other members of the sheriff's department to try to feed them a story about their boss, who he says is the ringleader of a plan to blow the airlock with gunpowder. It's a tough sell, as is his request to have them build a temporary holding cell in the cafeteria up top. So I suppose we'll see how that goes over next week. Then we see Knox have an epiphany, saying that he figured out who the snitch was before he went to see Walker. And I don't know. There's a lot about this part I wasn't sure how we were supposed to take. He opens by saying he knows who is helping IT and Judicial. Everything about the way he looks at Walk and delivers this makes it sound like he thinks it's her. Of course, we're thinking there's going to be this reveal that he has figured it out it's her, so I don't know if that's influencing it. But then he says it's Teddy's mom, and they both agree they could understand why she would do it, trying to protect her son. When he was there before, he asked a lot of questions about her not being able to leave, and knows she just went up through the barricades after getting a message while all other communications were shut down. But I'll be interested to see if I'm reading too much into this. He either screwed them by giving up their plan or did a pretty solid job of feeding them a fake one, which based on Bernard's reaction worked, as he couldn't look more pleased at feeling like he was one step ahead. That brings us back to Lukas, who continued to decode. We saw the first part of the message last week. If you made it this far, you already know the game is rigged. He took the second part to Bernard. We think we're the chosen ones, but we're really just one of many. The founders didn't build a single silo, they built 50. The next line reads, and they created the Safeguard, which sounds ominous when we first see it, and even more so when he hears it at the door at the end. The next time we see the page, we can't be sure how much is left out, but the final lines we get a look at before he leaves say, reason be damned, if you don't believe me, go to the very bottom of the silo. Find the tunnel, you'll get confirmation there. After that, he starts his journey down, gets his mother to agree to hold on to Salvador's version of the pact, tries to find Bernard but can't, and almost gets sent back up when he reaches the barricade before he convinces them he knows Juliette. When Shirley arrives, she's still unconvinced, but he gets her help by saying Jules might still be alive. They bond some down in George's lair over what a unique person Juliette is and how they all wish they could have done more to help her. He seems to win her over as much as that's possible in this situation, and as I mentioned, explains why he doesn't think he'll die when he makes his way to the water. In case he does, he tells her what Bernard told him about the helmet camera footage, but leaves out the part about the other 50 silos. I still laugh to myself in my head when I think about him falling into the water, but the tone quickly shifts when he approaches the door. He's met by a disembodied voice that the subtitles call the algorithm, and it knows his name. I went back to check episode 7 when he first entered the vault, and there's no reference to the algorithm when he introduces himself. But the voice in both cases sounds like a pretty generic AI one, so it's hard to tell. This one wants to know why he's at the door under the silo, and after he explains he was following Salvador Quinn's instructions, it tells him he's only the fourth person to make their way there. Before him, it was just George, Judge Meadows, and Salvador. The algorithm didn't talk to George, but he gave the other two the same directive he's about to give Lukas. There's also a warning. If he tells anyone about their conversation or what he's seen down there, they'll have no choice but to initiate the Safeguard. He checks to ensure he knows what that is, and even though we never saw him find anything other than the name, he says he does, and then it cuts to black and the episode ends. So it's a pretty massive cliffhanger to end an episode that has me really excited about the finale. Book readers mostly know what's going on here, so I won't pretend to speculate, but there are some interesting differences in how things played out, so it's not without mystery. Things are shaping up for a strong ending, and many of their choices are starting to make sense. People who started out the season with their feet planted pretty firmly on the ground, people like Paul and Kathleen Billings and the Sims, are starting to come around to what amounts to conspiracy theories. There's truth there, but no one has the complete picture, and it's making things pretty volatile. It might not be good for them, but it should be entertaining for us to watch. Plus, Juliette has her suit, and she seems poised to leave Silo 17 in a much better place than it was when she found it, and I think that's a good place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.